The Mojave Desert in August was a special kind of hell. Chief Petty Officer Thomas Garrett had been through SEAL training in Coronado, had deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan, had operated in conditions that would break most people. But there was something uniquely punishing about the Mojave, the way the heat pressed down like a physical weight, the way the sand reflected sunlight until everything became a shimmering mirage, the way your body started shutting down if you didn't stay ahead of dehydration. Thomas moved through the landscape with practiced efficiency, his movements economical despite the 110-degree temperature. Beside him, keeping pace with mechanical precision, was his Belgian Malinois, Ryan. The dog wore a specialized tactical vest with cooling panels and carried his own hydration system, technology that kept military working dogs functional in environments that would quickly incapacitate regular pets. They were 40 miles east of 29 Palms, California, in a training area that simulated the kind of desert terrain SEALs might encounter in Middle Eastern operations. What had started as a routine training exercise had turned into something else entirely when Command had radioed with new orders 2 hours ago. "Shadow 3, this is Command." The voice crackled through Thomas's earpiece. "We have a situation. Army unit conducting desert survival training lost contact with one of their personnel approximately 6 hours ago. Last known position is 3 clicks northeast of your current location. Your closest asset. Can you investigate?" Thomas had acknowledged immediately, changing course to head toward the coordinates. Lost personnel in this heat was serious. After 6 hours, you were looking at severe dehydration at minimum, possibly heat stroke, possibly death. Ryan seemed to sense the shift in mission priority. The dog's demeanor changed from training mode to operational mode. More alert, more focused, his nose working constantly to process the environment. Thomas had worked with Ryan for 3 years, and the dog's ability to adapt to different scenarios never ceased to impress him. The terrain was unforgiving. Rocky outcroppings interspersed with sand dunes, sparse vegetation that provided zero shade, and heat that rose in visible waves from the ground. Thomas checked his GPS, confirmed his bearing, and pressed forward. Ryan ranged ahead slightly, his training telling him to scout for threats or anomalies. "Command, Shadow 3, Thomas reported. "Approaching search area, no visual contact yet. Copy, Shadow 3. Be advised, missing soldier is Private Andrew Morrison, 22 years old, experienced in desert survival training. Unit lost radio contact during a navigation exercise. They've been searching but had to pull back due to heat casualties among searchers." That was bad news. If the search team was getting heat casualties, the missing soldier had been exposed for far too long. Thomas increased his pace slightly, pushing his own limits while monitoring Ryan for signs of heat stress. 20 minutes later, Ryan's behavior changed. The dog stopped, nose in the air, then began moving with more purpose toward a cluster of rocks about 200 meters ahead. His tail was up, body rigid, the alert posture that meant he'd detected something significant. "Good boy," Thomas said quietly. "Show me." They approached the rocks carefully, Thomas's training making him cautious even in what should be a training environment. You never knew when a training scenario might reveal something more dangerous: smugglers, illegal border crossers, or just the general unpredictability of remote desert areas. Ryan led him around a large boulder, and Thomas saw him, a soldier in army fatigues, lying in the minimal shade provided by the rock, not moving. Private Andrew Morrison looked like death warmed over. His lips were cracked and bleeding, his face sunburned so severely that blisters had formed, his uniform soaked with sweat that his body could no longer produce. He lay on his back, one arm draped across his face, the other stretched out beside him, holding an empty water bottle. Thomas dropped to his knees beside Andrew, immediately checking for a pulse. It was there, thready and rapid, but present. Severe dehydration, probable heat exhaustion approaching heat stroke. How the hell had he survived 6 hours in this heat? "Private Morrison," Thomas said clearly. "I'm Chief Petty Officer Garrett, U.S. Navy. Can you hear me?" Andrew's eyes fluttered open, bloodshot, unfocused, but conscious. "Water," he croaked, his voice barely audible. Thomas pulled his hydration tube from his vest, placed it carefully between Andrew's lips. Small sips, slow. Your body can't handle too much at once. Andrew sucked desperately at the water, and Thomas had to pull it away after a few seconds. "Easy, I know you're thirsty, but too much too fast will make you vomit, and that'll dehydrate you more." While Andrew took controlled sips, Thomas assessed his injuries. Beyond the obvious dehydration and sun exposure, there was blood on Andrew's right leg. His cargo pants were torn and dark with dried blood. Thomas carefully cut away the fabric and found a nasty gash, probably 8 inches long, running down Andrew's calf. It looked like he'd fallen on rocks, the wound deep enough to need stitches, but not immediately life-threatening. However, it had bled significantly, adding blood loss to his list of problems. "What happened?" Thomas asked, pulling medical supplies from his pack. "Navigation exercise," Andrew managed, his voice slightly stronger after the water. "Got separated from my unit. Trying to make it back to checkpoint, fell in a ravine, hit rocks, couldn't walk properly after that." Thomas cleaned and bandaged the wound, his movements efficient. Ryan sat nearby, panting slightly, but watching intently, the way military working dogs did when their handlers were focused on a task. "My unit," Andrew said. They were looking, Thomas said. "Had to pull back because of heat casualties. But they know you're out here. I'm going to get you home." He keyed his radio. "Command, Shadow 3. I have the missing soldier. He's conscious but in bad shape. Severe dehydration, heat exhaustion, significant leg wound, blood loss. He needs immediate medical evacuation." The response came back through static. "Shadow 3, understood. Be advised medevac helo is grounded due to mechanical issues. Next available bird is at least 6 hours out. Can you stabilize patient until then?" 6 hours. Thomas looked at Andrew, assessed his condition, and knew that 6 more hours in this heat, even with water and medical care, was going to be extremely dangerous. Andrew needed IV fluids, needed cooling, needed proper medical treatment that Thomas couldn't provide with field supplies. "Command, patient needs evacuation sooner. What about ground transport?" "Shadow 3. Ground transport from your location is minimum 4 hours in this terrain, and we're not sure patient can handle the rough ride. Medical assessment suggests helo extraction is still best option. Can you sustain patient for 6 hours? Thomas did the math. He had enough water for both of them if they were careful. He had heat emergency supplies. But Andrew's condition was precarious. Every hour increased the risk of organ damage or complete system failure. "Copy, Command. I can sustain for 6 hours, but I'm going to need support. Can you drop supplies?" "Negative, Shadow 3. No aircraft available. You're on your own until medevac arrives. Do what you can." Thomas acknowledged and ended the transmission. He looked at Andrew, who was drifting in and out of consciousness, then at Ryan, who was still watching attentively. "Okay," Thomas said aloud, organizing his thoughts. "We've got 6 hours. We need to keep him hydrated, keep his core temperature down, and keep him conscious. We can do this." He pulled an emergency reflective blanket from his pack, rigged it between rocks to create more shade over Andrew. He activated chemical cooling packs and placed them on Andrew's neck, armpits, and groin, the areas where cooling would be most effective. He rationed his water carefully, giving Andrew small amounts every 10 minutes. But the heat was relentless, and Thomas knew his supplies wouldn't last 6 hours. He was going to have to make a call he didn't want to make. "Command, Shadow 3. I need to head back to base to get more supplies. Patient won't survive 6 hours with what I have. I can make it to base and back in under 2 hours if I move fast." There was a long pause. Then, "Shadow 3, are you proposing to leave the patient alone?" Negative, command. My K9 will stay with him. Ryan's trained for casualty care protocols. He'll keep the patient alert and protected. Another pause. Shadow 3, that's irregular. But you're on scene. It's your call. Proceed as you see fit. Thomas looked at Ryan, who was panting in the heat, but still alert. You understand what I'm asking, buddy? Thomas knelt beside Ryan, looking into the dog's intelligent brown eyes. Ryan, guard, he said, using one of the dog's trained commands. Then he pointed to Andrew. Protect, stay. Ryan's ears perked up, processing the commands. He moved closer to Andrew, positioning himself in a way that suggested he understood exactly what was being asked. I'll be back in 2 hours, Thomas said, more to himself than to the unconscious soldier. Stay alive until then. He took one last look, Andrew lying in the makeshift shade, Ryan settling beside him, then started running toward base. It was the hardest thing he'd done in his career, leaving a casualty, trusting his dog to do what he couldn't. What Thomas didn't see, as he disappeared over the dunes, was what Ryan did next. The dog assessed the situation with an intelligence that transcended training. Andrew was in distress. His breathing was labored, his skin was dangerously hot, and his consciousness kept fading. Ryan had been trained in casualty care, how to alert handlers to injuries, how to stay with wounded personnel, how to provide comfort and protection. But what Ryan did went beyond training. The dog carefully positioned himself alongside Andrew's body, pressing against him in a way that provided shade and physical contact. When the cooling packs Thomas had placed began to lose their effectiveness, Ryan began licking Andrew's face and hands, the moisture from the dog's saliva providing minimal cooling but, more importantly, keeping Andrew conscious. Every time Andrew's eyes would close and his breathing would become too shallow, Ryan would whine and lick more insistently, the stimulation pulling Andrew back from the edge of unconsciousness. The dog seemed to understand that sleep, in Andrew's condition, could easily become something worse. Andrew, in his delirium, couldn't quite process what was happening. He had vague awareness of something warm beside him, something wet on his face, something that wouldn't let him drift away into the darkness that seemed so inviting. Dog, he mumbled at one point, his hand moving slightly to touch Ryan's fur. Good dog. Ryan's tail wagged briefly. Then he went back to his vigil, alternating between providing shade, providing stimulus to keep Andrew conscious, and scanning the area for threats. He shifted his position every few minutes to maximize the shade he could provide as the sun moved across the sky. An hour passed, then 2. The heat remained brutal, climbing past 115 degrees. Ryan's own body was suffering. His cooling vest could only do so much, but he never left his position. When he needed to pant to regulate his own temperature, he did so with his head positioned over Andrew, so the moisture from his breath would reach the soldier's face. When Andrew would start to moan or show signs of distress, Ryan would press closer, would lick his face, would provide that physical connection that said, "You're not alone, stay with me, help is coming." At one point, a hawk circled overhead, its shadow passing across them. Ryan watched it carefully, his instincts telling him that stillness in the desert attracted scavengers. He barked once, sharp and commanding, and the hawk veered away. 3 hours in, Andrew regained more awareness. His eyes opened and focused on Ryan with something approaching comprehension. "You're staying," he whispered. "Why are you staying?" Ryan's response was to lick Andrew's hand gently, then resume his position providing shade. "Your handler left," Andrew said, his dehydrated brain struggling to make sense of the situation. "You could have gone with him. You could be somewhere cool, with water." But Ryan didn't leave, couldn't leave. Something deeper than training, something fundamental to his nature, told him that this human needed protection, needed companionship, needed the assurance that he wasn't going to die alone in the desert. 4 hours passed. The sun began its descent toward the horizon, but the heat barely diminished. Ryan's tongue hung longer from his mouth, his own need for water becoming critical. But still he stayed, maintaining his vigil, keeping Andrew conscious with periodic licks and whines. "My mom," Andrew mumbled at one point, his mind wandering. "Need to call my mom. Tell her I'm sorry." Ryan whined softly, pressed closer. "I got a dog when I was 8. Andrew continued, his voice barely audible. "Named him Charlie. Best friend, until he died. Sophomore year of high school." Ryan's ears perked up at the word dog, as if understanding that Andrew was talking about something important, something that mattered. "You remind me of Charlie," Andrew said, his hand moving weakly to rest on Ryan's head. Same loyalty, same, won't give up." 5 hours in, the distant sound of rotor blades cut through the desert silence. Thomas had made it back to base in record time, loaded up with IV fluids, advanced medical supplies, and extra water. He'd been prepared to make the return trip alone, but the base commander had other ideas. "We're sending you back with a medic and a vehicle," Commander Caroline Stevens had said. "You were right. We should have mobilized ground transport immediately. The helo's mechanical issues are taking longer than expected, but we can get a Humvee out there." Thomas, the medic, a young woman named Leah Martinez, and a driver had loaded into the vehicle with supplies. But before they'd even covered half the distance, the radio crackled with good news. The helicopter was back in service and en route to the coordinates. Now, as the Black Hawk approached the cluster of rocks, Thomas leaned out to spot his dog and the casualty. What he saw made his chest tighten with emotion. Ryan was still there, still pressed against Andrew, his body positioned to provide maximum shade and protection. The dog's head lifted at the sound of the helicopter, his tail wagging weakly, but he didn't leave his position beside the soldier. The helo touched down 50 meters away, rotor wash kicking up sand and dust. Thomas jumped out before it fully landed, running toward Ryan and Andrew, with Leah right behind him carrying medical equipment. "Ryan!" Thomas called, and the dog finally stood, moving toward his handler, but immediately looking back at Andrew as if to make sure the soldier was being cared for. Leah dropped beside Andrew, immediately checking vitals. "Pulse is weak, but present. Temperature is dangerously high. He's severely dehydrated, but conscious." "How long has he been alone?" "He hasn't been alone," Thomas said, kneeling beside Ryan and running his hands over the dog's body, checking for heat exhaustion signs. Ryan stayed with him the whole time. Leah started an IV line, pumping fluids into Andrew, while Thomas gave Ryan water from his bottle, the dog drinking desperately. Andrew's eyes opened, finding Thomas first, then Ryan. "Your dog," Andrew whispered. "He saved my life." "He did what he was trained to do," Thomas said, but even as he said it, he knew it was more than training. "Stayed with you. Kept you conscious. Kept you alive." "No," Andrew said, his voice gaining slight strength from the IV fluids. "More than training. He cared. I could feel it. Like he wasn't going to let me die out here alone." Within minutes, they had Andrew on a stretcher and loaded into the helicopter. Leah continued treatment in flight, while Thomas sat with Ryan, who was panting heavily but seemed alert and responsive. "Good boy," Thomas said quietly, scratching behind Ryan's ears. "You did so good. I'm proud of you." Ryan's tail wagged, and he leaned against Thomas, finally allowing himself to relax now that his mission was complete. At the hospital at 29 Palms, doctors confirmed what Leah had suspected. Andrew was maybe an hour away from complete system failure when they'd found him. Another hour in that heat without intervention, and he would have died. The dog staying with him probably saved his life, the attending physician told Thomas and Andrew's commanding officer, Major Jonathan Webb. The physical contact, the shade, the stimulation to keep him conscious, all of that bought critical time. Major Webb, who'd been beating himself up for losing track of one of his soldiers, looked at Thomas with genuine gratitude. "Chief, I don't know how to thank you, and your dog." "Ryan," Thomas supplied. "His name is Ryan. Ryan deserves a commendation. Hell, he deserves a medal. What he did, staying with a stranger in that heat when he could have followed you back to safety, that's above and beyond what we ask of our working dogs." Andrew, cleaned up and receiving continued medical treatment, asked to see Ryan. Thomas brought the dog to his hospital room that evening, Ryan walking with slight stiffness from his own ordeal but otherwise healthy. When Ryan entered the room, Andrew's face transformed. "There he is," he said, his voice still rough but emotional. "My guardian angel with fur." Ryan approached the bed cautiously, his training making him gentle in medical environments. Andrew reached down to pet his head, and tears started rolling down his face. The relief, the gratitude, the overwhelming emotion of having survived something that should have killed him. "Thank you," Andrew whispered to Ryan. "Thank you for not leaving me. Thank you for staying when you didn't have to." Ryan's tail wagged, and he pressed his nose against Andrew's hand, in that universal gesture of canine affection. The story spread quickly, the way these things do in military communities. A Navy SEAL's dog stays with a wounded Army soldier for hours in brutal desert heat, refusing to abandon him even when he could have saved himself. It was the kind of story that reminded people why military working dogs were considered personnel, not equipment, why they deserved the same respect and honor as their human counterparts. But it didn't stay within military circles. Someone, probably a hospital staff member, mentioned it to local media. Within days, the story had been picked up by regional news, then national news. Ryan became briefly one of the most famous dogs in America. 29 Palms, the small desert town adjacent to the Marine Corps base, embraced the story with particular enthusiasm. It wasn't often that their community got positive national attention, and the tale of a loyal dog saving a soldier's life resonated deeply. The town council voted unanimously to give Ryan honorary citizenship. A local artist painted a mural on the side of the community center, a Belgian Malinois standing guard over a soldier in the desert, the setting sun painting the scene in oranges and purples. The local elementary school made Ryan their mascot, teaching students about military working dogs and the bonds between handlers and their partners. Thomas, uncomfortable with attention, tried to deflect praise. Ryan was just doing his job, he told reporters who managed to track him down. But Andrew, recovering in the hospital and facing a long rehabilitation for the damage the extreme dehydration had done to his kidneys, told a different story whenever anyone would listen. "That dog had a choice," Andrew said in one interview that went viral. His handler had left. The mission was technically complete. I'd been found. Ryan could have followed Chief Garrett back to base, could have gotten water and shade and safety, but he chose to stay, chose to protect me. That's not training. That's character. That's compassion. 6 weeks later, when Andrew was well enough to attend, the town of 29 Palms held Ryan Day, a community celebration at the high school football field that drew over 3,000 people. There were military demonstrations, working dog exhibitions, and speeches from local officials. But the centerpiece was a simple ceremony where Andrew, still using a cane but much recovered, presented Ryan with a custom-made medal. Not official military recognition, but something the community had commissioned. A bronze medallion engraved with Guardian of the Desert and the date of the rescue. Thomas accepted on Ryan's behalf, kneeling beside his dog, while Andrew stood at the podium with obvious emotion. "I'm 22 years old," Andrew said to the assembled crowd. "I thought I knew what loyalty meant, thought I understood sacrifice and duty, but lying in that desert, feeling my body shutting down, thinking I was going to die alone, And then realizing this dog was staying with me, was protecting me, was refusing to let me give up, that taught me something I'll never forget. Loyalty isn't about following orders. It's not about doing what you're supposed to do because someone tells you to. Real loyalty is choosing to stay when leaving would be easier. It's choosing to protect someone even when there's no benefit to yourself. It's choosing to care about someone else's survival as much as your own. He paused, wiping his eyes. Ryan didn't know me, didn't have any reason to care whether I lived or died beyond his training. But he stayed anyway. And in those hours, when I was drifting in and out of consciousness, feeling that presence beside me, that warm, loyal, unwavering presence, I understood something profound. We're not alone in this world. There are creatures who will stand by us, who will refuse to abandon us, who will fight for our survival with every bit of strength they have. This town is honoring Ryan today. But really, we're honoring something bigger, the capacity for compassion that transcends species, that doesn't calculate odds or consider rewards. We're honoring the truth that sometimes the most heroic acts come from the most unexpected sources. The crowd applauded, many people crying openly. Thomas stood with Ryan, one hand on his partner's head, feeling the weight of what Ryan had done settling into a new understanding. After the ceremony, dozens of people wanted to meet Ryan, to pet him, to thank him personally, as if the dog could understand their gratitude. Ryan tolerated it with patience, his tail wagging occasionally, but Thomas could tell his partner was tired and overwhelmed. They escaped to a quiet corner of the field where Andrew joined them, sitting carefully on the grass beside Ryan. I called my mom, Andrew said. Told her the whole story. She cried for like 20 minutes straight. She wants to meet Ryan someday, thank him properly. Ryan would probably just lick her face, Thomas said with a smile. That's all the thanks she'd need, Andrew replied. He looked at the dog, who had settled between them, panting contentedly. Can I ask you something? Do you think he knew that I was dying, that staying with me was dangerous for him too? Thomas considered the question carefully. I think dogs understand more than we give them credit for. They read body language, scent, energy in ways we can't fully comprehend. Did Ryan know you were dying? Probably. Did he know staying put him at risk? Maybe. But I think what he knew most clearly was that you needed help, and he could provide it. Everything else was secondary. Dogs are better than people, Andrew said quietly. No offense to you. None taken, Thomas said. Dogs have an advantage. They don't overthink. They don't calculate cost-benefit or worry about what others will think. They just act on what they know is right. Humans could learn from that. Andrew reached out and scratched behind Ryan's ears. I'm going to adopt a dog when I'm recovered. Already picked out a rescue from a local shelter, a German Shepherd mix named Zoe. She's older, has some health issues, probably won't get adopted otherwise, but after what Ryan did for me, I figure I owe it to the universe to give another dog a good home. That's a good plan, Thomas said, and Zoe's lucky to have you. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the celebration continue around them. Eventually, Thomas stood and helped Andrew to his feet. I should get Ryan home, Thomas said. This has been a long day for him. For all of us, Andrew agreed. He looked at Ryan one more time. Take care of him, Chief, he's special. I know, Thomas said. Trust me, I know. As they drove back to base, Ryan asleep in the back seat, Thomas reflected on the past 6 weeks. How a routine training exercise had turned into a rescue mission. How his dog had made a choice that revealed character beyond training. How an entire community had been moved by a simple act of loyalty and compassion. Military working dogs received training worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. They learned complex skills, followed precise commands, performed missions that saved countless lives. But what Ryan had done in that desert couldn't be taught. It came from somewhere deeper, from the ancient bond between humans and dogs, from the instinct to protect pack members, from the capacity for compassion that existed independent of reward or recognition. That night, Thomas submitted the paperwork for Ryan to receive official military recognition, the K9 Medal of Courage, awarded to military working dogs who display extraordinary devotion to duty. The medal would be added to Ryan's service record, joining the other commendations he'd earned during his career. But Thomas knew the real recognition wasn't medals or ceremonies or news coverage. It was the life saved, the soldier who'd go home to his family, the reminder to everyone who heard the story that heroism came in many forms, sometimes with 4 legs and a wagging tail. 6 months later, Andrew visited the base, fully recovered and preparing to return to active duty. He brought Zoe, his adopted German Shepherd mix, to meet Ryan. The 2 dogs sniffed each other cautiously, then began playing with the ease of animals who recognized kindred spirits. "She's been good for me," Andrew told Thomas, watching the dogs. "Helps with the nightmares, reminds me that there's still good in the world." "That's what they do best," Thomas said. "Remind us what matters." Andrew pulled out his phone and showed Thomas photos. Zoe sleeping on his bed, Zoe playing fetch, Zoe sitting patiently while Andrew went through physical therapy. In every photo, the dog's devotion was evident. "I tell her about Ryan," Andrew said, "about what he did for me. I think she understands somehow. Dogs know things we don't." Thomas watched Ryan and Zoe playing, 2 dogs who'd never met but shared the bond of having been there for humans who needed them. That was the lesson, he realized. That was what Ryan had taught not just Andrew, but everyone who'd heard the story. Compassion doesn't require complex reasoning or moral philosophy. It just requires recognizing that someone needs help and having the courage to provide it, regardless of the cost to yourself. Dogs understood that instinctively. Humans had to remember it, had to be reminded through stories like this that the capacity for selfless loyalty existed, not just in training manuals or military protocols, but in the heart of a dog who refused to abandon a stranger in need. Ryan had shown them all what true heroism looked like, not the loud, dramatic kind celebrated in movies, but the quiet, persistent kind that said, "I will stay with you, I will protect you, I will not let you face this alone." That was the gift. That was the lesson. That was what moved an entire town and reminded them all, soldier and civilian alike, of the unbreakable bonds that could exist between humans and the animals who chose to stand beside them.